because these mics would have to pick it up, and they were quite a distance away. So I had buttons installed by the Technical Security Division. We had a coffee thing down there, and so the mess boys could bring the president coffee when he wanted it. And one other, I think, was for Steve Bull. So we had a Haldeman and Butterfield button over here. I forget which was on and which was off, not that it matters. Although historians care about that sort of thing. And I was the cabinet secretary as additional duty, and so I'm standing right behind the president. When he came in, we actually did this formal thing at a cabinet meeting. Steve Bull would come in and say, "Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States." So when everyone stood up, I just stepped forward and hit the proper button to turn the things on. And I'm sure I always turn it off after a cabinet meeting. But I hear from John Powers, the archives, that someone must have hit, maybe the cleaning ladies hit that button by mistake when they were dusting, because there was a lot of superfluous conversation on the cabinet room tapes only. And then as a backup, I had a button put on my telephone, which had a great many buttons on it anyway. And there was one that wasn't doing anything, so we had the secret. That turned them on too in the cabinet room. So if I couldn't be there when the cabinet room began, I could hit that button at 2 o'clock if the cabinet meeting was supposed to start at 2. So that's...
Outside of you, who knew the system was being used?
Well, yeah, it was a deep, dark secret, and I want to say no one knew, but the people that actually knew are the president and Bob Haldeman and myself and Larry Higbee, Bob's staff assistant, one of 3 staff assistants of Bob. Al Wong, who was the Technical Security Division chief, Al Wong, W-O-N-G, and 3 technicians who put these tapes in, a fellow named Ray Zumwalt, Roy Schwalm, S-C-H-W-A-L-M, and Charles Bretz. They were the technicians. And one of those 3 changed the tapes when they had to be changed and that sort of thing. There was a little thing, they blasted a hole in the brick wall down underneath the White House and put all of this machinery inside a brick wall and then put a cabinet door over it. And I said to Wong, this is in the locker room of the protective security Secret Service agents. So when they come to work, they have little lockers in there and they change clothes and go home. They didn't stay long in this little room. And I said, aren't they going to think this great big panel on the where it used to be a brick wall, they're going to question that? He said, no, they probably won't. And if they do, I'll just say, we've got something in there, and they won't ask any questions. And that is true. The Secret Service wouldn't pry or probe something like that. But there was a hell of a big door in there. And it was a tiny little room, pretty large. I did want to say one more thing.
Go ahead.
As to purpose. There truly was, in case anyone thinks there was, it's been written about, there was no sinister purpose to the Nixon tapes, even though, well, we didn't know then how sinister Nixon was. But it was simply for history. He really cared about the history. And the interesting thing is that beginning with the Nixon administration, in January '69, we initiated a program called Memos for the President's File. So someone sat in on every meeting, even meetings with his own staff people. Arthur Burns would go in, but we'd have a guy in there sitting with the president and Arthur Burns. Or Pat Moynihan, he was a Democrat, so we had 2 guys in there. No, but we did. We had a sort of a, quote, trusted staff member in there taking notes. And after a while, the president said, don't take notes, because that does tend to inhibit the guest. So sit in there and soak up as much as you can, but as soon as you leave the meeting, go back to your desk and just write out, forget grammar and punctuation, just write out the essence of what happened in that meeting. And those were due into me. So I was running, most of my time was taken up with running around, beating people about the head and ears, getting the memo. They were due into me in 24 hours. And I kept the memos for the president's file. Kissinger was the worst because his meetings were the most complex, and he wasn't about to sit down afterwards and dictate a memo for me. And so we never did get them all. We probably got 60% of these. So when the tapes came along, I was sort of secretly and initially relieved. I thought, oh boy, I don't have to follow up on these memos, but we didn't stop that procedure. So we had two things going, the tapes and the memos for the president's file.
Did you ever get anybody asking a question of why are the notes no longer important?
John, could I add something about Eisenhower?
Yes, please, Mark.
Putting things in perspective, perhaps, Mr. Cannon was talking about President Ford being shocked that there was recording going on in Washington, D.C. Well, we know that Dwight Eisenhower was just a simple soldier, but in 1942, as a two-star major general in the War Department, he was recording conversations in his war room in the munitions building down in the mall, a temporary building. And it was, as Alex Butterfield was talking about, there was a very practical reason for this, because they were on dicta belts and the whole room was wired, and there would be a series of meetings. You had the delegations of officers coming from the United Kingdom, and you had heads of the various war industries coming in, and there were action memos that needed to be written, and his staff would take the dicta belts, transcribe them, and then just generate the action memos and letters that needed to be done. So it was Eisenhower never saw the finished product probably, but he wanted to have an efficiently run operation. And shift forward to when he was president of Columbia University. We have 38 dicta belts of conversations recorded in the office when he was president of Columbia that were released over a year ago. So this is something that was carried forward, and there are indications that conversations were recorded at NATO as well. We don't have any tapes or memos for the record. And then, of course, in the White House, it started in 1953, and the last conversation that we know about was in 1958. And there was a cabinet meeting in 1954 where the subject of the propriety of recording conversations came up. It was referring to telephone conversations, which was a widely known practice in Washington, that you had at least somebody on the dead phone, taking dictation, or perhaps you had a dictabelt going. But they were trying to set a guideline in the government, and Eisenhower at the cabinet meeting said, boys, it's a good thing when you're talking to someone you don't trust to get a record made of it. There are some guys I just don't trust in Washington, and I want to have myself protected so that they can't later report that I said something else. So that's from the non-cynical Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Which leads to my next question. Mr. Butterfield pretty well stated in terms of Nixon that he just wanted to complete history and it just went on. There's a sense in terms of, and I guess I add Eisenhower now to Kennedy and Johnson, that it might have been selectively off and on. And do you have any comments, any or all three of you, as to whether that was in fact the case, that the presidents were recording what they wanted to have recorded and definitely not recording what they did not want to have? Claudia?
Well, President Johnson definitely did select the conversations that he wanted, although sometimes we think that the recorder was left running and conversations were recorded accidentally. There's evidence of that. But so far as the influence that had on him, I think that he would forget that the recorder was running. He would talk to these people based on who they were, what they wanted to hear, and to make a record. I think the people that he recorded, he wanted to have a record of, or either because he was afraid that they would distort what he said or accidentally distort what he said, and he would be able to fall back on this record, or because he wanted to have it to use later on. He did use these when he wrote The Vantage Point. He used them extensively, and you can find portions of the transcripts in The Vantage Point when you read it.
Sheldon?
Well, that's a very important question, and it really leads into another question, I think, which is the question which has been raised over and over again by so many people. I could show you a half a dozen citations in major works that suggest that because the president knew he was being taped, that therefore in some way he was playing to the tape, or that he was selecting. I find the argument completely preposterous for several reasons. Kennedy was kind of sloppy and careless about it. For example, he didn't record his meeting with Andre Gromyko on the 18th in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is a shame, to say the least. Why? I imagine he was just so absorbed with it that he didn't think to turn the machine on. Other times he forgot to turn the machine on until the meeting was well underway. Then there were times when he left it on and forgot to turn it off, and there is a case with the cleaning crew recorded, which is very funny. And but that's the real issue, though. Again, I want to get back to that for a moment. Is the question about whether or not, because these presidents knew they were being taped, that in any way compromises the value of the tapes as history. In other words, I could cite one person who said, well, because they knew they were being taped, they could manipulate the historical record. I want to say as strongly as I can that I think that is an absolutely fallacious argument for the following reasons. Number one, I'm talking about the Kennedy case, which is the only one I really know about in any detail. How in the world could anybody do that without people seeing what he was doing? I mean, all Kennedy had was an on-off switch under the table in the cabinet room and a similar switch, two switches actually, in the Oval Office. I mean, and he had no fast-forward, play, record buttons, nothing of that sort, no time, no counter, no time counter. How can he think about it, a stressful thing like the Cuban Missile Crisis, 15 people in the cabinet room? How would he possibly be able to choose when he wanted the machine to be on or when he wanted it to be off or whatever? It's preposterous on its face. But even more important than that, and this people simply lose sight of, is the fact that John Kennedy believed that these tapes were private property, that they were his private property, and they were his private property. That didn't change for more than a decade after his death. And therefore, it never would have occurred to him that you and I would ever hear these tapes. Why would he have to manipulate the tapes when he could determine who would hear them, if anyone would ever hear them? It's preposterous on its face that he would do that. But even more important than that, and by the way, the Nixon case, as Mr. Butterfield suggested, the fact that he knew he was being taped and he incriminated himself tells us, I think, something about the argument not making much sense. But the last argument I want to make without taking too much time is, I think, that that basic notion, it simply ignores the simple fact of what historians call presentism. And that is, how did John Kennedy know in the middle, let's say, of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is my area, how that was going to come out in the end? How would he know in the middle of the crisis which position to take at the meetings, which would look good 30 or 40 or 50 years down the road? How would he know that when he didn't have the slightest idea how things were going to work out even an hour later, not to mention a day later? The same thing is true of Robert Kennedy. And let me just quickly give you one or two examples. Robert Kennedy's, on those tapes, is incredibly combative and confrontational. Is that what you find in his book, 13 Days? No, not at all. Well, obviously, by 1968, he had discovered the fact that it was better to be a peacemaker at those meetings. And so we don't see the confrontational Bobby Kennedy in the book. But believe me, he was one of the most confrontational people in those meetings. And that's because he didn't know. How could he know what would be the right position down the road? And if you look at some of the examples of some of the decisions that Kennedy made, let me just give you two very quickly. When he argues with the Joint Chiefs on October 19th, he tells them he's going to institute a blockade, and they're very upset about it, especially General LeMay, the Air Force Chief of Staff. They say it's too weak, it's a feeble response. The Soviets will, or the Cubans will strafe Florida with MiG aircraft and maybe even fire the missiles at the United States. Well, what if that had happened? What if they had done that? And assuming that it had not gone to nuclear war, which is a big assumption, let's assume that it had not gone to nuclear war, people would be listening to the same tapes today, and they would be saying the Joint Chiefs were right and Kennedy was wrong. He did the wrong thing. He should have bombed the sites as the JCS told him to do.